me. Awaken me.
Oh no! My Halloween special! Hello, and welcome to the first ever Halloween Scarathon. I've realized I forgot my costume. Here, let me see if it... yes. Old MacDonald had a farm, E.I. Cthulhu. Whoa, there it is. Huh. Well, what do you think? My favorite costume, Cthulhu, the Great Slumberer. Welcome. We have a very special treat for you tonight with the first Halloween Scarathon, a night of back-to-back scares and nightmares. I hope you will enjoy. Now, settle in, get your candy, your costumes, because the first story is a creepy tale from the House of Mouse. The River Country Film by Anonymous. It had been 3 years since my family had last gone on vacation to Florida, something we did annually before the recession hit. Since we now had enough money, my parents decided, under the popular demand of my sister and I, that we go to Walt Disney World again. We were both teenagers, and our parents kind of saw this as a bit juvenile, but decided it would be fun anyway. I couldn't wait to finally go back, and neither could my sister. Being avid theme park goers as well, we were especially attracted to the creativity and the, magic, as one would say about the rides there. They never got old and had their share of nostalgia and excitement. However, there was one other reason I wanted to go. Now, you normally associate Disney World with such words as excitement, fun, and happiness, but with these characterizations come counterbalances. After scrolling through OMG Facts one night, I came across a rather interesting fact. It was about an abandoned water park in Walt Disney World, apparently named River Country. I was absolutely appalled by this, since I previously thought of Disney as in a more idealistic and perfect way. The water park was directly on the shores of Bay Lake, being that huge, stagnant body of water adjacent to the Magic Kingdom. River Country was, and still is, on the same side as the theme park just mentioned, but right next to a resort called Walt Disney's Fort Wilderness Resort. Surrounding the water park on the resort side is a large green wall with signs dotting it. The place opened in 1976 and used water from Bay Lake in most of the park's attractions. It was a very rustic and wilderness-based design, and contained artificial rocks that resembled those used on another attraction, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. There was a dam present to keep chunks of dirt and mud from getting into the water, too, so guests didn't have to worry about swimming in an artificial bog created by water from the lake. It was open for 25 years, closing its doors in 2001. And in 2005, a statement released by Disney said that the park would be closed for good. So, for about 11 years, River Country has been sitting abandoned, nature in its advanced stages of reclaiming the area. But the slides remain, and so do the artificial rocks, and the same pond, now a swamp, that was used for swimming. Many urban explorers have infiltrated the area, jumping over the walls to get footage of the abandoned water park. One of the most controversial things about the park nowadays is why it closed, which is what I was destined to find out. I wanted to see some real footage from the area before it closed, as, well, since from what I heard, it was very joyous and bustling with tourists, compared to its ghost town status today. I was without internet at the time, so about 2 days before we were planning to leave, I went to the local library, which archived many old videos that people in my community had dug up in their attics and donated to the library to be part of a small historical society. Hoping that I might find some good footage, I asked the librarian if they happened to carry any videos concerning family vacations. She nodded and brought me to a small selection, containing many old VCR cassettes and a few DVDs here and there. After about half an hour of searching, I finally came across a cassette with the words, "Old-fashioned swimming hole" inscribed on top of it. This was a term used to describe river country during its glory days, so I took it, almost certain that it was the footage I was looking for. I asked the librarian if I could sign it out, but she told me that the historical videos had to stay in the library. I could, however, watch the video in a small conference room behind the front desk. The librarian led me into a windowless room, and I took a seat in front of the television. She left the room and closed the door so that the audio would not disturb any of the other library patrons. I popped the cassette into the VCR under the TV and turned the lights off so I could see the video better. I was expecting the quality to be low anyway, and for about half a minute or so the screen was gray and was accompanied with a loud beeping noise, typical for old VHS cassettes. The gray soon disappeared, showing footage of two individuals in front of the entrance to river country. They were both men, and it was either very late at night or very early in the morning, as nobody else was in the park. Very few of the water park's lights were on either. On the bottom left corner of the screen, the date, November 1st, 2001, was displayed. This was significant because the water park closed for good the very next day, on November 2nd. The two men were talking about how they had been denied entrance to the park that morning, since it had reached its guest capacity limit. They also stated that at only these hours of night could they get past the park security. The two walked up to the bigger water slides in the park, which led directly into the pond, supplied by the green water of Bay Lake. Once they both got to the top of the slide, which was encircled by artificial orange rocks, one of the men prepared to slide down, and the two laughed over what had seemed to be an inside joke, and finally, the cameraman ended up pushing his friend down. I heard him scream in delight as he descended to the pond. The cameraman then proceeded back the way they came to go get to the slides, and across a bridge that traversed the small lagoon. He ended up back at the pond shore where the sound of a splash was heard. This was when the video started to unsettle me a little. After waiting at the shore of the pond for about 3 minutes, nobody surfaced. And the cameraman began to cry his friend's name frantically and started to run back to get help from the Fort Wilderness Resort. He stopped abruptly, though, at what seemed to be the kiddie area, a small, shallow pond. On hearing a faint cough, he instantly turned around and saw a barely visible shadow about 10 or so feet behind him. Relieved, the cameraman started to approach his friend, glad that he was okay. But again, he abruptly halted. The friend's head was hanging down, and he slowly inched it up. The cameraman started to hyperventilate as the features of the other man's face began to show. Crimson, dried blood was caked around his mouth, and some was even dripping off of his chin. He was missing all of the hair on his head as well, but one of the most disturbing parts of this image was that there were patches of skin that were missing and revealing parts of the man's skull and jawbone. And he was even missing his right eye, leaving an empty socket. I became severely nauseous at the sight of this, to the point where I was swallowing my own vomit. My heart also began to race as fear started to settle in my body. As the last minutes of the film approached, the horrendous figure muttered something that sounded like,
"There is no hope under the water."
And with that, the cameraman ran for his life, wheezing and panicking throughout his ordeal. I wanted to turn the television off and run by myself, so I bolted to the door leading out of the room. I reached for the doorknob, but paused. The television was giving off the sound of an old furnace found in a basement of a home, just in a softer tone. This tone, for some unknown reason, kept me from moving anywhere. And I was just staring blankly at the television. The cameraman was still sprinting, but didn't seem to make any progress. He ended up back at the large pond where the slide had dumped his friend, and you could hear him sobbing softly, fearing for his life. Suddenly, the tape began to gradually slow down as the man frantically looked from side to side. The audio volume, along with the furnace sound, went up as the video lagged. Haltingly, the cameraman turned all the way around and shrieked at the sight of his friend. The video paused on this frame, exposing the caked blood all over the man's face. The top of his skull bone was now completely exposed and his right eye still missing. His mouth was wide open, and coming from it was what looked like the combination of the water from Bay Lake and bile. This stayed on screen for about 10 seconds and switched to a black screen, displaying one single message. The epidemic begins today. Instantly, the power went out, and I was left alone in the darkness of the conference room. I became so terrified as I couldn't see a thing, and I couldn't see the door either. I began to shake in absolute fear. River Country had closed because of this, and it was obvious that Walt Disney World had been keeping a disgusting secret. I rushed to the other side of the room, disoriented, but all I felt was warm breath seeking down my neck, and the smell of bile. Oh, welcome back. Sorry, just can't figure out how to get this lit. Let's see if the book has any instructions. Ah, here's something. The Midnight Game by Anonymous. The Midnight Game is an old pagan ritual used mainly as punishment for those who have broken the laws of the pagan religion in question. While it was mainly used as a scare tactic to not disobey the gods, there is still a very existent chance of death to those who play the Midnight Game. There is an even higher chance of permanent mental scarring. It is highly recommended that you do not play the Midnight Game. However, for those few thrill-seekers searching for a rush, or those delving into the obscure occult rituals, these are simple instructions on how to play. Do so at your own risk. Prerequisites: it must be exactly 12 a.m. when you begin performing the ritual, otherwise it will not work. Here's some things you're going to need. You'll need a candle, a piece of paper, a writing implement, matches or a lighter, salt, a wooden door, and at least one drop of your own blood. If you are playing with multiple people, they will need their own of the aforementioned materials, and they will have to perform the steps below accordingly. Step 1. Write your full name, first, middle, and last, on the piece of paper. Put at least one drop of your blood on the paper, and allow it to soak into it. Step 2. Turn off all the lights in the place you're planning on doing this. Go to your wooden door and place the paper with your name on it in front of the door. Now, take out the candle and light it, and place it on top of the paper. Step 3. Knock on the door 22 times. The hour must be at 12 o'clock a.m. upon the final knock. Then open the door, blow out the candle, and close it. You have just allowed the Midnight Man to enter your house. Step 4. Immediately relight your candle. This is where the game begins. You must now lurk around your new completely dark house. with the lit candle in your hand. Your goal is to avoid the Midnight Man at all costs until 3:33 a.m. Should your candle ever go out, that means the Midnight Man is near you. You must relight your candle in the next 10 seconds. If you are not successful in doing this, you must then immediately surround yourself with a circle of salt. If you are unsuccessful in both of those actions, the Midnight Man will create a hallucination of your greatest fear and rip out your organs one by one. You will feel it, but you will be unable to react. If you are successful in creating the circle of salt, you must remain in there until 3:33 a.m. If you are successful in relighting your candle, you may proceed with the game. You must continue to 3:33 a.m. without being attacked by the Midnight Man or being trapped inside of a circle of salt to win the game. The Midnight Man will leave your house at 3:33 a.m., and you will be safe to proceed with your morning. Indications that you are near the Midnight Man will include a sudden drop in temperature, seeing a pure black humanoid figure through the darkness, and hearing very soft whispering coming through an indiscernible source. If you experience any of these, it is advised that you leave the area to avoid the Midnight Man. Now remember, do not turn on any lights during the midnight game. Do not use a flashlight during the midnight game. Do not go to sleep during the midnight game. Do not attempt to use another person's blood on your name. Do not use a lighter as a substitute for a candle. It will not work. And definitely do not attempt to provoke the Midnight Man in any way. Even when the game is over, he will always be watching you. Good luck. You are going to need it.
Oh, hey, George.
Oh God, Stormy, help! The Banshees killed Tom!
No, sorry. I won't be able to come to the ghost hunt tonight. I've got the Halloween special I have to do.
Keep your hands off me, witch!
Okay, well, you have fun. Don't get possessed. Sorry about that. You know, ghost hunting actually reminds me of a story. Here it is.
I once asked a famous ghost hunter what his scariest moment was. This is his story. By u/DRAINISINTHEFLOOR. Back when I was in college, the Student Campus Activity Council hired a famous ghost hunter to come speak at our school. I've always loved the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hightailed it over to that auditorium. The ghost hunter was someone I'd never heard of, but he had an impressive background and seemed to have several things in the works at the time. This was in 2005. I think he might actually have a TV show now. He was a man of small stature with a little white professor's beard and a receding hairline. But the way he spoke about the afterlife was fascinating. You could tell he truly believed what he claimed to see. Either that or he was a hell of a salesman. He had us hanging on every word. We watched some interesting video clips of his investigation. He had a nice collection of photos and scary stories to go with them. I remember one about a haunted doll he said moved freely around the room of the person who had picked it up at a flea market, just not when anyone was around to witness it. Towards the end, he opened up the floor for questions. There were your typical dumbass college kid questions. Have you ever seen someone's head spin around like The Exorcist? Stuff like that, and a few were actually pretty interesting. I decided I wasn't going to let this opportunity to speak to someone who apparently was so revered in the field of supernatural slip away. And so I raised my hand. The ghost hunter spotted me, pointed, and smiled. Yeah, you, the girl with the white shirt. Yeah, hi, I said. And I know I sounded nervous, because I felt so dumb for sounding nervous. I was just wondering, what's the scariest thing you can remember from your career as a ghost hunter? I was halfway back in the auditorium, quite a distance from the stage, but I saw his face fall. I know I did.
Well,
He said, forcing a tight little laugh. It was forced. I know it was.
there's so many scary moments to recall. They tend to pop up quite often when you're in my line of work.
This got a little chuckle from the audience. I suddenly felt pretty stupid for asking the question at all. He proceeded to tell some story about tracking a poltergeist in an abandoned elementary school and his flashlight failing. I remember it because it wasn't really scary at all. Or at least it didn't seem that way for someone who hunts ghosts for a living. He moved on from the story and answered a few more questions, and he didn't look my way ever again. When it was over and everyone started to leave, I decided not to get stuck in the crush of students leaving through the front door. Feeling somewhat dejected, like I had done something wrong, I slipped quietly out of the theater exit and headed to my dorm. The ghost hunter was sitting outside on a bench near the bike racks, smoking a cigarette. I ducked my head and tried to get by without him noticing.
Hey, kid.
He took another drag and crushed the cigarette out on the cement bench beside him. Listen, I'm sorry, I remember blurting, feeling like such a stupid kid. I know my question was dumb. I wasn't trying to make fun of you or anything. He shook his head, brushed some ashes off the bench, and he patted the space beside him, inviting me to sit. I hesitated. This could definitely be a case of stranger danger, just like they taught us in the intro to university classes, and then sat down, but keeping a healthy distance between me and him. He was old, I was young. I could probably outrun the guy, or who knows, maybe it was just as stupid as I felt.
I didn't tell the truth,
the ghost hunter said. His face looked much older close up, wrinkles deeper. The confident salesman aura had faded from him, leaving behind a man in his 60s who had clearly seen a lot of things.
That story I told, it wasn't the scariest moment of my career.
I know, I remember saying. He nodded, as though he had known that I knew.
This is the scariest moment of my career, he said.
And this is what he told me.
It was the 1970s. I was a much younger man. I hadn't reached the success in the paranormal industry quite yet, and was left picking up the scraps that the pros didn't want. Usually, they were schizophrenics whose broken minds tricked them into believing they were phantoms after them, or children playing pranks on gullible, concerned members of the neighborhood. If anything, it was a simple cleansing of the home with sage, and I went off. When I first got the call, I was ecstatic. What the client was describing appeared to be a full-blown demonic haunting, complete with physical manifestations, possession, and multiple witnesses. It was the break I was searching for, the break I needed. The only detail that truly worried me was their teenage son, the person they claimed to be suffering from the possession, had become violent with members of his family. Up until recently, he'd only acted out of character, moody. However, a week prior, he had attacked his older female cousin. She was shaken, but mostly unharmed. The family sent her to live elsewhere until it could all be figured out. Therefore, when I headed out to their home, I made sure to arrive fully prepared. I brought holy water, crucifixes, sage, and, just for good measure, a small loaded handgun. I knew it wouldn't come to that, but something about the mother's frantic tone over the phone told me it was just a good idea. I wish I could say the visit was exciting. Unfortunately, from the moment I pulled into the driveway of the beautiful remodeled Victorian, all activity seemed to stop. That is, if it was ever there to begin with. I spent 2 weeks investigating that home. I used equipment considered very technologically advanced for the era. I studied energy waves. I interviewed the son whose family claimed to be possessed, when in fact he just seemed depressed, perhaps psychologically disturbed. I recommended a therapist, a renowned child psychologist who was famous for his work with violent young men. On my last day in the house, they took him into the city for treatment. His parents returned shortly before midnight, retiring wearily to their bedroom. leaving me alone in the kitchen to go over my findings. There was nothing to be said, and I knew it. Everything they described could be written off as the hysterics of a family who couldn't admit that their son was in desperate need of medical attention. Everything that is, except for the drains in the floor. Upon touring that home, I was impressed to know how up-to-date it had been. It was clearly from the early 1900s and kept in immaculate condition. The woodwork and the character of the house was carefully preserved as if it was given necessary updates, like modern plumbing and electricity. The basement was the only area that seemed stuck in time. The walls were a clammy stone that was prone to gathering moisture, leaving it unfit to store anything vulnerable to spiders or mold. The family had left it empty for this reason, and while it certainly felt spooky to spend any amount of time in the windowless room with a single hanging light and the vast cement floors, I never recorded anything of note in this area. However, there was one thing I couldn't understand. Given the approximate time the home had been built and its presence in a residential neighborhood, there was simply no accounting for the 4 large slotted drains in the cold concrete floor. As I sat alone in the kitchen poring over my meager findings, trying to find meaning in all these words, I heard something. It was only a little sound at first, so I ignored it, but then it came again, louder this time. There's a steep spiral staircase that led to the 2nd floor, winding up from the corner of a small kitchen, and it was where the noise seemed to be coming from. Assuming it was simply one of the homeowners restless after dropping off their son in an institution, I glanced up. It was coming down the stairs. I can't say walking because that wasn't the case. It was just... floating isn't even the right word, just coming. Coming down the stairs, straight at me. It had no eyes, no face, and yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, right at me, into the very depths of my soul. And then it spoke. I'm not sure how it spoke. I don't think I actually heard anything, so perhaps it used some sort of telepathy. Either way, I can recall the words to this very day. You know what he did to us. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just ran. I upended my chair when I fled, scattering papers across the kitchen that claimed this house wasn't really haunted, and it was all the hallucinations of a very sick boy. I left them there. Do you know how awful that is? I left those people in that house with that thing. I didn't stop driving for 30 miles, for God's sake. When I realized how far I'd gone, I finally pulled over and called the family from a payphone. They were the furthest thing on my mind when I saw it. All I could do was respond to the deep animal instinct to escape, run out of that supposedly safe house with my tail between my legs. They moved, I think. I was unable to continue my investigation. In writing, I cited insufficient evidence, but I knew it was cowardice. I believe that house was leveled a few years later. I ended up doing my own research. Curiosity ate away at me with vicious little rat teeth as time went by. The accusation's still ringing, fresh in my ears. You know what he did to us? And eventually, yes, I did. The old newspaper clippings didn't tie the story together. Not necessarily. But I was able to piece some meaning out of the yellowed excerpts. At some point around the turn of the century, the house had been residence to a well-respected mortician. Unable to find a building in his own town to suit his needs, he said, he built his own home office space. It was a grand feat of architecture, a shining example of a true entrepreneur, a man pursuing the American dream of running his own business. Upstairs, bedroom, mid-level, the funeral home, and in the basement, the mortuary. I knew what the drains were for. Separately, decades later, another well-respected member of the local community was arrested under the suspicion of abuse of his professional position with moral cause. The newspaper didn't elaborate, probably due to the sensitive nature of the crimes, but his punishment was minor. After a brief stay in the local jail, the perpetrator stripped his home of all of the value and left town before trial, never to be seen again. It didn't take much to guess the connection. I suppose I don't know for sure, but the words of that thing still echo in my head to this day. You know what he did to us. There was a reason that mortician felt such a strong desire to build a house that contained his business, to suit his needs. The things that were done to those bodies in that basement were unspeakable, but yes, I know what he did to them. And it's because of this, coming face to face with the true nature of a man in its darkest places, that the encounter with that faceless thing is the scariest moment of my career. Because now I know. I still remember his expression. The way the color dropped out of him as he went on. The white hair of his beard barely distinguishable from his pale skin. The slump of his shoulders, and the way his voice shook. I apologized. He waved me off and left. I felt terrible. I still feel terrible for making him relive that moment, but as campus activities were replaced with bills of my own career, the ghost hunter fell from the forefront of my mind little by little. Until last week when I moved in with my fiancée. When I took the boxes into the basement, despite his warnings of spiders and mold. Because there's a large slotted drain in the center of the room. And I'm so worried, so scared about what I might know.
Not going to lie, it would have been really cool to see a ghost tonight. But, yeah. Fun fact about me, did you know that I was actually first introduced to true terror on Disney's Haunted Mansion ride? Yup. Horrifying incident with a leaf blower and a Disney churro. Rest in peace, Steve. But enough of that. How about the next story?
Disney Catacombs by HorrorFan664. So a couple years back, my buddies and I tried to stay in the park after closing time. Our plan was just to take pictures, nothing sinister or anything like that. We just wanted to be able to say we did it, you know? Basically, we snuck in from bathroom to bathroom, corner to corner, and managed to stay there until they closed the gates and the maintenance team got to work. We were really surprised we hadn't gotten caught. It was almost strange considering how much talking up Disney security gets. Our hearts were beating like crazy, and we sat there for a while, hiding behind a tombstone by the Haunted Mansion. And it's true. The Disney staff had signed their names on every single one. So finally, we got the courage to roam about, still being careful as to not be seen. It was really eerie. The occasional guard or maintenance worker would walk by, and we would just duck or hide behind a corner. It worked. For about half an hour. Of course, we couldn't keep it up for long, and yeah, they caught us. I mean, give us props for even attempting and succeeding, but that's not where the story ends. So the first thing we said when they caught us was, "Are you going to take us down to the dungeon?" And we laughed. The security guard chuckled too, so the mood wasn't too dreary. He told us we weren't the first people to try and sneak in after hours, but he wanted to know how we did it. We explained the situation, and he actually laughed and said that wasn't a bad plan. He told us he had to take us to Disney jail to be further interrogated, which we thought was odd, but we figured from the beginning that if we had gotten caught, they'd take us down there. It might have been our plan all along, Maybe we wanted to see the Disney Catacombs more than we wanted to be in the park after hours. So we called for more workers to come and help him escort us, and we went on our way towards Toontown. Then they took us down in this elevator, right into hell. The first thing we noticed was how expensive looking the elevator was. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's hard to explain. It was like a stainless steel interior with mirrors all around, and the floor was this tacky red carpeting, but it looked expensive. There were only 2 buttons in this elevator, not counting the emergency buttons. One said up, the other said down. I'd forgotten to mention that they never handcuffed us or zip-tied our hands. They just kind of walked beside us, expecting we'd follow. Not that we would have tried to make a run for it. I mean, these people seemed decent. Like, how are we supposed to know what was going to happen? The elevator stopped and we started walking down this perfectly shining, bleach-smelling corridor. There were no doors on either side. It was just a plain, empty corridor. We walked for what seemed like an eternity, and no one was talking any longer. It was me, my friends, the security guard, and 2 other maintenance workers. Finally, we reached a heavy metal door that had a security code and a card reader. One worker put in his card, and the other typed a code onto the keypad. I watched the code he typed. It was 121566. I only remember it because I found out later what its significance was, and it makes me laugh, looking back. Strange. It's strange that I could laugh looking back. They led me and my friends into another corridor. This one had doors down the hallway walls. Each door had a little plexiglass square, a 10-inch by 10-inch window at the top right corner. It looked sort of like a psych ward, to be honest. Not much like a jail. He led us to room 1901, and inside was a single desk with, surprisingly, 3 chairs for me and each of my friends. And then they left us in there alone, closing the door on the way out. We sat in the chairs like obedient little children and waited for them to return, but they never did. 2 hours went by and no one came back for us. My buddy Tim went for the door and, surprisingly, it was unlocked. He didn't open it, though. He was worried there'd be a guard out on the other side and that they'd think that we were trying to escape, and we weren't looking for any more trouble. So, about 25 minutes went by. When we got restless and finally decided to leave the room, the hallway was empty like before. No signs of people. Nothing. We started calling out, "Hello, is anybody there?" No one answered our calls. We noticed surveillance cameras were placed above every door, and we got to wondering if there was any living soul in that place at all. We noticed the surveillance cameras were placed above every door, and we got to wondering if there were any living souls in this place at all. We should have left right there and then, but then again, whoever does the right thing in these kinds of situations. Every door looked the same, and each one had a specific number above it. They weren't like in order either. Say rooms 1 to 10. They were scattered numbers. For example, our room had been 1901, but the door next to it was 1205. We got to thinking and finally assumed they were just randomly chosen. We walked up that hallway and had no idea where we were going and what we were hoping to find, or even if it mattered. My other buddy, Guy, decided we should just leave. He said that if they really wanted us here, they'd have to come back, and maybe it was just a scare tactic. Maybe they just wanted to trick us into thinking we were being arrested and were waiting for us outside to laugh. I felt wary of the whole situation, and Tim was just quiet the whole time, nodding his head here and there. He was more interested in looking into the doors with little 10-inch by 10-inch windows, and that wasn't a good idea. I tried to tell him, but of course, no one listens to reason when they're freaked out, and we were definitely freaked the fuck out at this point. The cameras above the doors were capable of motion detection and followed us as we wandered down the desolate corridor. A little red light at the bottom of the lens, blinking each second. No noise filled the air. All we heard was each other breathing. And then it happened. We had reached the end of the hallway. Unfortunately, the door at the end had another pin code reader. I tried the pin from before, the one I saw them type in, but it was invalid. At that moment, the lights in the hallway shut off and we heard the doors. God damn it. I could still hear them to this day. The fucking doors opened, all lining up along the corridor, and they made a subtle creak and then a boom as they hit the wall beside them with force. As I said, after I entered the invalid code into the keypad, the lights shut off and the doors opened, except for the door with the keypad. We also noticed as the doors opened, each doorway had a little bit of light seeping from its open pathway. We stood there, stunned for a good 5 minutes, not knowing what to do. We figured we tripped some alarm and this was just a protocol, a standard drill in case of an attempted escape. What were we supposed to think? So we turned the other direction away from the locked door. A sense of panic hit all three of us for some reason, and we got the urge to run. No one agreed to running. It was like we all knew we had to at the same time. Some sort of instinct, like a baby gazelle knowing when to run from a lion. We were in the lion's den, all right. It wasn't until about the 10th door we passed that we began to look into doorways as we passed them. Standing at the doorways were people in costume. We were running past Donalds, Mickeys, Goofies, Plutos, and all different kinds of Disney characters. It was insane, and we screamed at the top of our lungs. I know they say never look behind you as you run, but I did. They were leaving their rooms and following us. Not running, just casually walking towards us. I think that's what made it much more terrifying. Almost like they knew we had nowhere to go. Now, I don't know if this was all in my head, but maybe just from sheer panic and fear of the moment. But I swear, I could swear on my mother's life, I heard It's a Small World playing over the intercom. See, I have a fear of dolls, and the ride always gave me the creeps my whole life. Now I could see them, the little robotic dolls standing in the doorways as we passed, still following were the costume characters. The dolls weren't chasing us, thank God. I would have died from a heart attack if I had seen the dolls following suit, but they didn't. It didn't make the situation all that better. I mean, how many times have you been followed by a group of costumed individuals seemingly out to fucking eat you alive? At least that's what I told myself to keep moving. Stopping meant being devoured by fucking Donald Duck. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go out like that. Tim was crying, and Guy was sweating and breathing heavily, and I just kept turning my head to see if we were being followed, and of course we were. I'm not sure how many doors we had passed at this point, or if there really were different characters at each door. But I knew this hallway had to end at some point, and we were getting the fuck out of this place pronto. It was easier said than done. I looked back after another minute or two of running, and noticed there was nothing behind us anymore, or that we could see. I heard footsteps, but figured we had gotten so far ahead that they were still just walking casually like before. The hallway was still going on for what seemed like forever, and Guy needed to stop, or he was going to faint from exhaustion. The door beside us was open with the light, but nothing inside. I decided we would hide in there until we caught our breath and could continue forward. As we closed the door behind us, I noticed the room was 1966. Again, that meant nothing at the time. Tim was pacing the room, Guy was laying on the floor, still breathing pretty hard, and I was at the window, looking out. I saw nothing. No more music, nothing. It was dark out and hard to tell for sure, but I figured I would have seen figures, shadows, or something. Still, I kept watch. After 15 minutes or so, Guy said he was good to go. Tim was the only one smart enough to pull out his new Razor cell phone. No signal, of course. He opened the door subtly, quietly, and heard no footsteps. Nothing was following us anymore, but We weren't taking any chances. We got back to running. It only took us another 7 minutes to reach the door, give or take. It had no keypad and it was open. We entered the corridor from before. Thank God there were no doors. We ran for the elevator and got in, pushed the up button and stood there, looking at each other, dumbfounded as to what just happened. None of us spoke. We just waited until the elevator opened, back to Toontown, and started making our way for the front gate. We kept a low profile, using the same duck and hide technique that had gotten us this far from the get-go. Maintenance workers and security guards were still about, but we couldn't take any more chances. Finally, Tim lost it and took off in a sprint. I couldn't imagine what had sent him off until I looked and saw that everyone in the park just stood there, staring at us, with blank faces. We heard a voice over the intercom explaining that 3 fugitives had escaped from captivity and needed to be escorted back to the jails below. We booked it, catching up to Tim. Costumed characters appeared from the shadows, workers and guards chasing after us. Everyone was sprinting for us. I couldn't see well, but I imagined drool dripping from their jowls. They wanted us back down there. We had escaped, and they were pissed. The gate was just up ahead. The creepiest thing about it all was, beside the voice over the intercom, the park was dead silent. No chat from the workers could be heard, even now as we're running for what we assumed was our lives. From the characters, the workers, the guards, no one bothered to shout out after us. No one yelled, no one said, "Stop!" Nothing. Just footsteps and the occasional cough from Guy. As we made it past the park's front gates, we didn't stop until we got to the parking lot. Our car was gone, and we were left scratching our heads. We continued running down the road, which went on for miles, stopping occasionally for us to catch our breath. We made it to a little corner store where Tim used his cell phone to call a taxicab. When it finally arrived, we took the cab back to the hotel we were staying at, paid the fare, and went up to our rooms. In the end, the next day, we got a call from the hotel's front desk, so we headed downstairs. There were officers waiting for us. We said our car had been impounded and we needed to pay the fine. They didn't ask us any other questions. We didn't bother telling the police anything that had happened. Even now, on this random board, people who don't have a reason to disbelieve me don't believe me. So how would an officer of the law be expected to? We didn't bother. We simply paid the fine and drove home. We didn't talk about what had happened the whole drive back. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I got myself to search up the numbers. Curiosity, I guess. As some people may know, Walt Disney was born on December 5th, 1901. The room we were in was 1901, and the door next to it was 1205. And he died December 15th, 1966, which was the key code the worker had put in to lead us to the main corridor. What a strange coincidence, I decided. Whether any of that was real at all, I couldn't tell you. Maybe our imagination ran wild. We were tired. It was around 1 a.m. when we made our escape. So it's plausible that's the answer. I'll never forget it, though. I haven't been back to Disney since.
And that is why my favorite horror movie of all time is... Oh boy, trick-or-treaters. Hello, ghouls and goblins. Oh well. Maybe the rain is keeping them away tonight. Anyway, I'm going to continue looking through the spellbook and see if I can find anything while we read the next story.
The Rake. by author unknown. During the summer of 2003, events in northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York, and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group, and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. Number 1. A Suicide Note, dated 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assay any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him, for once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again, I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Linny, I've prayed for you. He spoke your name. Entry 2. A journal entry. Translated from Spanish. 1880. I've experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand, I will not sleep. His voice, in an unintelligible text. Entry number 3. A mariner's log. 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake. Entry number 4. Statement from a witness. 2006. 3 years ago, I had returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he had gotten out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said something. After adjusting to the dark for a half-second, I was able to see what caused that strained reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large, hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned
as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around to the side of the bed and then crawled quickly into a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot away from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5. It just seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' rooms. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over, about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. Neither of them survived. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel room near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got into contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen a creature we now referred to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave us any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature at the first 3 pages, and never mentioned it again. The ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the record at 8 times normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough even to begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and now I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head devastate me. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me.
Okay, let's see if there are any spells to potentially stop the rain. Ah! Ra-ra, ra-ah, Roma, Romama. Ah! Nope, 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 nope.
The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers, with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees, that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me. To me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sere memories, when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond, to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined, and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb to the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that shroud some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in the many of the moldy books. From such books, I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct, as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle, the shade grew denser, and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude of my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock. Black, ruined, and deserted and sinister, with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of haunted invulnerable mold, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height that I had attained. All at once came an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice. I felt my head touched a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trap door of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully, and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped when necessary to pry it open again. Believing I was now at prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled around for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky, and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many aeons cut off from the castle below. Then unexpectedly my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquility through an ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dare not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from the lofty Ambiance, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was or what my surroundings might be. Though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows, where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable, ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company, indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection of the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there. A hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway, leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness, the inconceivable, indescribable, an unmentionable monstrosity which had a simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping idolation of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape. And in its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort toward flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of this carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the foetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness, the hellish accident my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in what that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altar edifice in which I now stood. I recognized most terrible of all, the unholy abomination stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is a balm as well as a bitterness, and that balm is Nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trap door immovable. But I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of the Nephrin Ka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any guides save for the unnamed feasts of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom I almost become the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has calmed me, I always know that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. Annie96 Is Typing.
Like Pascal Chatterjee.
You asleep?
No, guess you're not either.
Can't. It's the wind. Sounds like cats fighting. What's your excuse?
Studying.
So that's what they call porn now?
Annie, what the fuck?
Not denying it?
I still can't believe what Johnny did today.
Me neither. That boy has issues. What the fuck? The wind's so loud. That doesn't seem normal, lol.
No wind over here. Just rain.
Lucky you. I need my beauty sleep.
Damn right you do.
What? You mean I look... Shit. I think I heard footsteps on the gravel outside.
Get your crazy dad to check it out.
I'm home alone. The fam are on holiday, remember? I told you this.
Really? Till when? We should hang out.
They really sound like footsteps, but there's something odd about them. I should look out the window, but my bed is so warm.
Sure, you want to look out the window when you're alone. What if there really is someone out there in your garden, looking up at you?
Not funny, David.
Wow, chill. I'm sure it's nothing.
Gonna check. BRB.
It's something strange in your neighborhood. Who you gonna call?
David, there's someone in the garden.
What? Really?
Yes, I can see the man's back.
What's he doing?
He's looking for something? On his hands and knees in the bushes.
He must be high. Probably looking for his drugs.
David, this is serious. What should I do?
Nothing. He'll probably go away by himself.
OMG, now he's digging with his bare hands. He's ruining the garden. Shit, he's turning around.
What does he look like?
David, what the fuck? This isn't funny.
What?
How are you doing that?
What are you talking about?
I can see you in my garden. How are you writing here without touching your phone? Look up. I'm by the window. Can't you hear me banging on it?
Fuck, Annie. Now you're scaring me too. I'm definitely not in your garden. That's not me.
Stop playing around. I can see your face, and you're wearing that stupid football jacket you're so proud of.
It must be someone who looks like me. Honestly, Annie, I'm at home. I wouldn't play around like that.
It has to be a friend of yours, David, playing a sick prank. How else could he be wearing your jacket?
There are loads of jackets like that. My friends don't look anything like me. You just have me on your mind.
He's digging again. Fucking leave already!
Annie, do you have a gun in your house?
Don't be stupid, David. I couldn't shoot anyone.
You don't have to use it. Just show that you're carrying.
Doesn't that jacket have your name on the back?
Yeah, the team all got one with their name on it.
I can see your fucking name.
What?
What the hell is this, David?
Annie, that jacket's in my closet.
Fuck, he's seen me. Why is he smiling like that? He's coming.
Call the cops. Annie? Annie, pick up. I've called the cops. Told them there's a break-in attempt at your place. They said they're on their way, but it'll take like half an hour. Annie, are you there?
It's in the house. Can't talk, I have to be quiet. Lights off. I'm in a closet with a knife. Hard to type, shaking too much.
Fuck, hang in there, Annie. The police will be there in about 20 minutes. Do you know where he is?
It. Not he. The look it had when it saw me, David. No person could look like that.
Jesus Christ, does it know where you are?
No, I grabbed the knife when I saw it running toward the house, and I got in the closet when I heard it breaking in.
Okay, good. You'll be fine. A druggie doesn't have the brains to find someone hiding in a closet. The police will be there soon.
Oh God, it's calling out to me. It doesn't sound like you, David. Its voice is so deep. Filling the house. Filling my head.
What is it saying?
Come out, Annie. I just want to look at you. It keeps repeating that over and over. Have I gone mad, David? Is this what it feels like?
Just 10 more minutes, Annie. Keep it together. You are so strong. You'll get through this.
It's coming up the stairs, but so slowly. Irregular steps. Why does it look like you, David? Why you?
I don't know, Annie. Please believe me.
Can you make it stop? Please make it stop.
I would if I could. I promise you.
It's at the end of the hall. David, I didn't say anything to my parents when they left. I was listening to music. Is that the last time I see them?
Annie?
This has something to do with you, David. Only you can make it stop. Think fast.
I don't know, Annie. God, please.
Please.
It might be because I think about you so much. I think about you all the time.
So stop.
I don't know how.
It's scraping something on the walls. The wall's getting closer. Please, David.
I'm trying. I'm really trying.
It's slowing down. Try harder. Whatever you're doing, it's working. It stopped. I can't hear anything.
Really? Don't go out yet. Stay put until the police get there.
What should I tell them if he's gone?
Everything, Annie. Everything you told me.
I didn't know you felt that way about me, David.
I'm so glad it stopped.
Can you come over in the morning, David? I really need to see you.
Of course, Annie. I'll be there.
Great. Can't wait.
Annie? Annie, how do I know this is you? Annie96 went offline.
Well, now that horrific incident of terror is over, on with the next story.
The Russian Sleep Experiment by author unknown. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on, but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past. And the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were now, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering into the microphone and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about his behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream.
The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes, and the screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphone hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming from 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. In the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction. They used the intercom inside the chamber. Hoping to provoke any response from the captives, they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We're opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice respond. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out amongst the researchers and military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphone began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of the loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in life. The food rations past day 5 have not so much as been touched, and there were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working. Digesting food, it quickly became apparent that they were digesting what was their own flesh that had been ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special ops at the facility, but still many refused to return into the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count that one committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured, and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine. Derivative, and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one of the doctors. Their heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after they had bled out, to the point where there was more air in the vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in the reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare him for surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought up to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even through the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles that were still attached to the skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to the surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, then try the surgery without anesthetic, and didn't react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given. I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor. and their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all three stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that, at this point, all three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bounds with all of his might, first left, then right, and left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off of his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brain waves. In surprise, they were normal. Most of the time, but sometimes flat-lined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning back to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves changed to that of immediate deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwave showed the same flat lines as one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as the three researchers. One of the named three immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, and then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal minds. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go into the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. "So, nearly free."
Oh, looks like a bat got in when I had the door open. Well, it seems to be harmless for the moment, and it actually reminds me of another fuzzy little friend.
Mr. Widemouth by Perfect Circle 35. During my childhood, my family was like the drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island. But there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless, chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring, but in my heart, I know they were real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine. Population 643. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways, it was a waste of space, but It was one of the only houses on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute of my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks, boredom always looming just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. The first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth, because his mouth was so large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body. His head, his eyes, his crooked ears. But his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kind of like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look.
"Furby? What's a Furby?"
he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy, the little robot thing with big ears. You can pet and feed it, kind of like a real pet."
"Oh,"
Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity.
"You don't need one of those anymore. They aren't the same as having a real friend."
I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me.
"I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore."
We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The 3rd or 4th morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face.
"I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until your mom comes to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game."
After my mother delivered more books and soda at my usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under my bed and tugged my hand.
"We have to go to the room at the end of this hallway," he said.
I objected at first because my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open, and then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline.
"I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend that there is a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try."
I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said.
"But that's all part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you might as well just bounce on a real trampoline."
I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe some other time," I said. "I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment.
"If you say so,"
he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box.
"I want to teach you how to juggle," he said. "Here are some things that you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons."
I looked in the box, and it was full of knives. "My parents will kill me," I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. "I'll be spanked and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned.
"It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try."
I pushed the box away. I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air." And Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there for the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window. A big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to get back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed at my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me.
"I have something I want you to see,"
he said. I must have given him a weird look because then he said,
"It's safe, I promise."
I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house.
"This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age, and when they're all ready, I took them down this path to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day I hope to take you there."
I returned to the house, wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last of our things had been packed into the moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he had said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in a truck at 4 a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. "Early enough for you?" he asked. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son. I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Dad gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends." I opened my eyes as we backed out the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in his hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house once stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. And out of curiosity, I followed that deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind the tree and scare the living hell out of me. But I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. Once I reached the end of the trail, I found that it ended at New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. Looking over the tombstones, I noticed that most of them belonged to children.
Well, it seems our Halloween night is reaching its end, which means it is time for one of my favorite horror stories of all time. A true tale of aquatic terror. I hope you all enjoy.
Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more, penniless and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable. I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific, but the packet of which I was supercargo fell in victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean's forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation. So that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we and her crew were treated with all of the fairness and consideration due us as a naval prisoner. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I had somewhat found myself south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable island. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept, and details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awakened, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at such prodigious and unexpected transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and other less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black, in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain underneath unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, straining my ears as I might. nor were there any sea fowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking and brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little. The next day I made myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with the graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a far-away hummock which rose higher than any other elevation of the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following days still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise it had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plains was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down on the other side of the immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illuminate. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim of the fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscence of a paradise lost, and of Satan's hideous climb from the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for the descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty on the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian depths where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom winding out of sight in both directions and almost lapping my feet as I stood at the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed to the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of the conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas reliefs, whose subjects would have excited the envy of Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men. The creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy and bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly, out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale represented as but little larger than itself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment I decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Pittledown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond conception of most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. And then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like, and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly whenever I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature only utters at its wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by a captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew I could not believe, nor could they. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with the peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has only given transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all. having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not have all been pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lie sun-stricken and raven in an open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself. But ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering in its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day where they may rise above the billows, to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of a puny, war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst the universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as if some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!
Whew, that one always gets me. And with that, it seems that this year's Halloween Scarathon has come to a close. I hope you all had just as much fun as I did. I got a new pet bat. I think I'll name him Vlad for now. And I got to see a ghost. Speaking of which, I guess I need to figure out what to do with the body. I guess I could bury her out back with the rest of them. But I thank you all so much for coming tonight. Happy Halloween to all of you. And I hope to see you in the next video. If we all survive. What? Where am I? Whoa.
Welcome, Stormy. I am the slumbering god Cthulhu.
Cthulhu? Wow, I'm such a huge fan. Wait, you know my name?
Of course I do. I've summoned you.
I can't believe it. I'm such a huge fan. I made a costume and everything. I believe I captured your...
Yeah, no, the costume was great. Listen, I have a task of utmost importance. You must continue to read from the Necronomicon until my slumber is broken. I mean, until the rain that has plagued your land has stopped.
Yeah, sure.
Then I will make you... Wait, did you say yes?
Of course. You're Cthulhu. Who wouldn't listen to you? Especially to stop the rain.
It's taken some mind control in the past. You know what? Never mind. Go into the world and spread my madness to those... I mean, read until the rain stops.
Whatever you say, Cthulhu.